Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stories That Shape Us. My name is Joanna Daniel. Have you ever heard the term emotional honesty with God or just emotional honesty? I heard it for the first time today, said like that. I think I understood what it meant when I heard it, and I understand what it means, but I've never heard it in terms of being emotionally honest with God. And as I thought about that, I thought, how do we I know I'm emotionally honest with God. I'm authentic. I'm honest. I go cry my prayer. I go tell him I'm confused, tell him I don't agree, ask lots of why questions because I don't believe that we can frighten him, scare him. I believe that he's open to answering our questions and he's patient and compassionate and understanding. So when I thought about emotional honesty, I thought about something that I shared this week on my social media about writing trauma informed Bible study tools. And initially, these trauma informed Bible study tools were for people who lead Bible studies to be able to help us to be emotionally honest in settings like that, because sometimes emotional honesty is not present in places where Bible study is happening. And that's because I believe sometimes the leaders don't always have the tools, the skills to be able to listen and to be able to integrate those experiences and to give you the opportunity to be honest with what you're feeling and to be able to say it. Sometimes you may have tried to say things and bring your own experience in when there's Bible study and it's shut down or ignored. And I say to leaders sometimes, that may not be the message that you wanted to send, but your actions send the message anyway. That says your pain is not okay here. We don't want to hear about your pain. And that can be frustrating when you want to share a real story of a challenge that you've experienced, something that you've overcome, and how it fits in with the Bible study that's happening, or a question that you might want to ask, and but the room cannot manage the question, meaning that the people that are in the room are have not looked at their own wounds. They're still afraid of theirs, and so they're not able to hear yours. And when that happens, it can feel shaming. Like you can be left with a lot of embarrassment if you've tried it before, a lot of frustration, and that frustration and embarrassment might send you away from, as opposed to leaning towards. And so that's why today shame, I'm talking about how shame dies in safe spaces and how to make the space safe for shame to not thrive in. And I believe that when we can tell our stories, as much of our stories that is accessible and available to us, then shame will die for other people too, because now people know, the sister beside you, the brother beside you will know that, well, then I can share my shame story too. Well, I can share authentically. Well, I can be honest about what's going on for me. So at Stories That Shape Us, we want to, and at Wounds to Scars, where Stories That Shape Us is under, we want to be honest. And that's why we do conferences and retreats, because we want to provide safe spaces for people to share honestly in. Our next conference is the Trauma Recovery Conference, June 16 to 18. And we thrive to provide those safe spaces for people to heal in. Now, I'm sharing that today because for the rest of this week, we're going to talk about a subject that there's a culture of silence around it, and it's sexual abuse. We're going to talk about how it affects marriages. I'm going to talk to couples therapists around how it affects the relationship and to get some insight from them around, some of the ways we see sexual trauma plays out in marriages and how it plays out in individuals within the marriage. And, if you listen to the interview that I did with Christy and Andrew Bauman around sex and intimacy in Christian marriages, we touched on some of these ways that sexual trauma impact marriages. And one of the things that I took away from them was that if that is your story, it's really important that you process your story, that you allow yourself to acknowledge and to heal um, from your story. We know that it's not always safe to share the story with your partner, because if they're not safe, then sharing your story, when we're sharing our story, we're being vulnerable. And vulnerability, shame dies in safe spaces. But if the space is not safe, then, shame is compounded. So I want you to assess for yourself whether or not it's safe to share. But what we want to encourage you to do rather is to find a safe space to share it in so you can start to heal. When we're doing groups for women who are healing from sexual abuse here at Wounds to Scars, they're virtual groups. We know that sometimes it's the first time people are sharing their story in that group setting, first time. But as we go through the 12 weeks, it becomes safer and safer. That means you experience it safer and safer. Everybody is sharing honestly and openly, and that is what makes a space safe. So I want to come back to what I start with about trauma-informed Bible studies. That is what makes a safe space. If you're a group leader, if you are leading any kind of group in setting, whether it's religious setting or otherwise, the space becomes safe when everybody's sharing honestly. And sometimes, as the leader, you take the lead with that. As you encourage and as you share in a way that is honoring to you, not oversharing or not sharing stories that you're not comfortable with. But as we start to be honest, then other people know that it's okay to be honest too. So, going back to sexual trauma and shame in safe spaces, we're going to go through that this week. I'm going to talk to an OBGYN about how we become re-traumatized sometimes giving birth, and some of the ways that that impacts our relationships, how it impacts our individual relationships with ourselves, how it impacts our marriages, how it impacts our parenting. In a very particular way, sometimes it impacts parenting, because there's so many things that as women we don't know when we experience sexual trauma, because we don't know how to look out for it. And simple things can trigger us, like breastfeeding sometimes triggers us when we've experienced sexual trauma. And I'll go some more into that this week in the interview, as I talk to different professionals and perhaps share some of my story. If you've not read my book, Shattered But Not Broken, you can get it at shatteredbutnotbroken.com, or you can get it on Amazon, or on our website, woundscars.com. And although I don't go too much into how being re-traumatized giving birth, I really want to honor those stories. And if you have stories that you'd like to share anonymously, if you're more comfortable with that, around being re-traumatized giving birth and how that impacted how you parent, we want to make the space this week safe for women who have experienced sexual trauma to be able to talk about, and to heal from. You can send your questions to Joanna at woundscars.com. We can answer them in the podcast. We'll answer them as I speak to the different professionals. We can answer them, or we can deal with them. What we're aiming for is a space where you can be emotionally honest with yourself, with God, with the people that are around you that are safe enough to hear it. And Brene Brown says, not everybody has earned the right to hear your story. So I also want you, as you're thinking about, maybe you've never shared your story, but who earns the right to hear it? Who are those people that you'll give the honor, because it's an honor and privilege, of hearing your story? Not everybody deserves that privilege of hearing it, because not everybody has allowed themselves to look at their own story, to process their own story. And so they won't be able to hold yours with the sacredness that it deserves. And it deserves that. So when you're sharing your story, it deserves people who are able to hear it, to witness it in the way that you want to tell it and want to share it. So those are some of the things that are going to be happening this week on Stories That Shape Us. If you're following us on Spotify, please continue to do so, and share the podcast with your friends and with your families. And if there's anything that you want us to deal with throughout this week of ways in which sexual trauma impacts our lives, please send your questions in using the contact details below, and we will try our best to answer it. If you've read my story in Shattered But Not Broken, I am honest in the ways that it has impacted my marriage and my own life. And there's so much more of that story to tell, about the safety of that was provided for me to heal in, and I am passionate about providing spaces for women who experience trauma, because those times when I was healing, there was no, there probably was safe spaces, but I didn't know about them. And so I want to talk about this as loud and as honest as I can, so that you may know that you don't have to struggle alone, that there's a place that you can go to put the burden down, to talk through it, to learn ways of coping and to overcome, because you've seen a sister who overcame, and you know that because she did, you can do it too. That you practice those resilience building tools. I talked about some yesterday in the and feel what you're feeling episode of Stories That Shape Us. And there, throughout the very first episode, as well as Stories That Shape Us, I talk about owning your emotions. And if there's anything that stirs up some really big emotions, is sexual trauma, being triggered by different things and different ways that we can practice our resilience building tools that is helpful to us. When I share tools with women and hear them using those tools effectively so that they can move themselves back to a place of peace, it does my heart good. And sometimes when I hear them sharing those tools with other people, because when you've learned something and you pass it on and other people get to benefit from the resources, that also does my heart good. So I hope that you're going to stay with us this week. Share it with your friends. If you're not yet following us on YouTube, please follow us so you don't miss any of this week. We know that 1 in 3 women experience sexual trauma, and we know that men do too. And so we know that that's a massive percentage of our audience, and maybe of your family member. Any room that you're in, if it's 3 of you in that room, one would have experienced it. It may not be you, it may not be your experience, but it's the experience of somebody in that room. If you're a church leader listening to this, a third of your congregation has experienced it, and you will want to minister to them in a way that is meaningful to them, because shame dies in safe spaces. If you want your congregation to be a safe space for people who have experienced sexual trauma, to know that when I go, I'm going to hear something that's going to minister to where I am and help move me on, you'll be making disciples without even trying. So I hope that you will stay with us this week as we aim to dive deep into this subject and to speak from a really honest place so that we can get help to the people who need it. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Stories That Shape Us. I hope you'll join me on the next story.